Hi everyone, welcome to an amazing panel we have here at Film.Music.Media. My name is Kai Savas and we're here for the Chilling Crescendos panel. We're here to talk about the sounds of horror and thrillers across different types of shows and films and different media all around. So let's jump in and welcome our panelists. So first up we have the supervising sound editor for Disney Plus's Goosebumps. Please welcome Ethan Beigel. Hey Ethan, how's it going? All right. Next, we have the composer for this comedy horror films Zombie Town and Trick or Treat Scooby Doo. Please welcome Ryan Shore. Hey, Ryan.
Hello.
All right. Next, we have the producer and music supervisor for the audio drama Hollow's Bend, the radio play. Please welcome Jennifer Smith. Hey, Jennifer. And last but not least, the composer for the paranormal series SurrealEstate. Please welcome Spencer Creaghan. Hey, Spencer.
Hello.
All right. Well, I guess to just kick everything off, we'll just we can all just talk about. We can go around and just talk about how all of you kind of approach developing. I think atmosphere is such an important aspect of this genre. So I want to talk about, I guess, starting and developing an atmosphere. I guess an atmosphere, a tone, to kind of for the compositions, especially in this kind of horror thriller world. So, Spencer, why don't you kick us off because you have a pretty unique project.
Yeah, I mean, Real Estate's an interesting one because it's equally as it's a horror show, it's also a family drama. So trying to
Yeah.
balance those tones is unique. I find because every house has such a unique quality as well, it's trying to figure out what makes this house stand out from the next one, and sometimes that comes to using different orchestrations, instrumentations, or even found sounds such as a dog barking and a dog growls and dog barking and things like that, which I will get into a later question because I can't wait to dive into that more.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Jennifer, how about yourself? I mean, talk about that's a different, completely different out of the world of film and TV. So talk about kind of creating atmosphere kind of in your world.
Well, when I create atmospheres for film and TV, it's a very different perspective because you have a visual element. But in the audio space, especially with radio dramas, the audience creates their own visuals in their mind. So you really have to figure out the balance between creating a space for people to use their imagination, but also giving them the freedom to imagine what they want. And especially in the horror genre, when you're using music and tones, you're kind of creating almost the camera with the ears, and every person's unique and different. So it's a very different thing where you're using sound design, silence, different audio tones, as well as
Yeah.
music to kind of create these different spaces, whether it's a mist or a house or a creek or a light bulb or a spirit. Every little thing is kind of more toned in audio wise in a different way that you're listening to different things to kind of say, how do I create that crescendo, that and that
Yeah,
breath?
absolutely. Ryan, how about yourself?
I find that every project is different, and so much of what to do on each project is really based on the needs of that specific project and the conversations that I have with the filmmakers. Just the two projects that I've done recently are, even though they're both a type of a horror project, they're so different. You know, Trick or Treat Scooby Doo.
Yeah.
There's a whole history with Scooby Doo and the 1970s sound and how to blend that with the horror sounds, the spooky nature of Scooby, but because that audience is a younger audience, so there's different requirements for that, so that the kids can be scared, but it's safe scary.
Right.
Whereas on Zombie Town, that movie called for a totally different approach. That was a throwback to like 1950s horror movies with these big, orchestras, these big, overpowering, sounds of these doom orchestras. So I find that every project is just different. And that's what I really love about it, is I was thinking about it before we did this panel. I think I've maybe done about a dozen horror films, and they're all different, whether it's like a torture type of a horror movie or whether it's a found footage, like Jennifer was saying, it's every project has its own sort of direction to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And Ethan, how about yourself? Because you come from sound editing, and that you have you get to manipulate things and mix things. So talk about creating atmosphere from your end.
Yeah, I mean, like what Jennifer said, since we're slave to picture, and what I do, a lot depends on the mood and supplementing the color of what we're doing, and the location of where we're at. So like my most recent one that I'm doing now, which is Goosebumps, it's in the Pacific Northwest, so we play a lot with sort of that cooler winds, cooler trees rustling, a lot of the waterfront sounds and things like that, distant buoy bells and stuff, just to create
Yeah.
a little bit of tension that way. But yeah, we really focus on what is the world that we're seeing and utilizing the sounds that you would hear in that place to bring it into something more atmospheric and eerie.
Yeah, absolutely. So can we go around again and talk about, I wonder if anyone could share like a specific instance where you had to kind of enhance the suspense in a film or project through your kind of musical or creative choices, something that needed just a little oomph for raising, and what you had to kind of do to kind of bring up that suspense moment. So Ethan, maybe you want to kick us off for an example that you have from Goosebumps maybe, or something else.
Well, Goosebumps, a lot of the series takes place in this house, which is the haunted house. And, right from the first scene of the first episode, it's a lot of the house is sort of on the attack.
Yeah.
And so we played a lot with, what could that thing be in the attic, and the creaking in the floor, and a lot of off-screen sound before things start flying off the shelves and chandeliers start. But you set up the tension of just this door opening on its own, revealing the crickets outside, and setting up this character's fear, and then hearing some thundering from up above. And is it footsteps? Is it a monster? Is it people we don't know? And that sort of thing. And that's the kind of tension that we were trying to play with right in the first scene of the very first episode.
Wow, that's awesome. Jennifer, how about yourself?
So for Hollow's Band, the radio play, again, it's the audio medium. So we're really having to build out, and sound is so important. Hollow's Band, the radio play, we're dealing also not only in the real world, but also in the spiritual world. And our narrator and main character takes our audiences between the spirit world, the main world, and kind of like our Scooby-Doo crew, because it's a group of teenagers. Kind of call them the Scooby-Doo crew in my head. Having to kind of bridge those different things. And in one of our parts, because we have a 3-part episode, it's kind of like a radio play, so it's in 3 parts. Our spirit world, we're kind of going in with him and going in with him in this mystic mist that transcends different worlds and talks about different fears. Everyone's fear is different. So having to really fine tune what is fear, what is the past, what is the present, and to make your heart as a listener kind of go, oh my gosh, I'm panicking with him. What is that sound? What is that creature? What is that everything? And to really kind of come into your mind. We really had a fun time creating this mist soundscape between sounds and music and sound design and all those different things. So that was really, really fun about what is fear, what is my version of a monster sound of fear, and kind of really working with the team on that was just so much fun.
I bet for just in terms of just an audio, like something that's just purely audio, or even with your work with mixing, I mean, you're kind of scoring in a sense when you have to dial up the intensity, you have to build a flow, you have to kind of get that momentum going, and sound can be such a huge part of that, not just score, but sound mixing as well, and with the score. But I mean, especially with sound effects, whether a phone maybe will cut through and like kind of pierce through or something like that. So it must be so much fun just to kind of build out and find like the right moments to kind of get the moments you want.
Yeah, and music plays a part in that as well, because music has transcend time. If you hear something from the 50s or even the 1800s, it gives you a sense of different personality, different eras, and to mix it into a mist of a sound design or a soundscape, and scoring it in a way also kind of like adds to the dimension that helps your audience imagine this kind of mystic, spiritual fear world.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's jump to the other Scooby-Doo crew over here. So Ryan, how about you? How do you kind of enhance the suspense,
Well, one of the things I like to think about is how to make each score as signature as possible to that individual project. And so, for example, with Scooby, even though the basis of the score is largely orchestral, I always try and find ways of enhancing it with interesting instruments. Hopefully things that separate it, from just a straight orchestra score. So like on Scooby, I know I also put in theremin. There was a character named Trevor who I scored largely with a harpsichord, and so it's different types of sounds.
Yeah.
Distorted electric guitars or interesting vocal effects. I love experimenting with those sorts of things, especially when they are specific to characters or scenarios, so they become like a part of the thematic material.
Absolutely. Well, Spencer, how about yourself?
Kind of taking a similar approach. I love combining different instruments that you wouldn't think about, and seeing how we can make those scary or terrifying. I scored a film back in 2020 called Motherly, and it's a home invasion. And many of the scenes are the lead actress walking alone in basically like an empty house, and we know that someone's probably in the house with her, but we don't know where they
Right.
are or who they might be, anything like that. And I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if we had a wood block every now and then go boom, just happen in random moments where you wouldn't expect it. How would that enhance the fear? And the result was almost jump scares without there actually being like a physical jump scare, like in the picture. And because the actress isn't reacting to the music, it added this extra level of almost supernatural fear in how would otherwise is a non supernatural film. It's almost like when you're walking alone in either like the woods at night, or you just have to go to and get something in like a dark room, and you know that there's nothing there, but you can't help but
Yeah.
feel the fact that you've heard the wind, or you've heard the floors, you've heard something happen. It doesn't actually happen, but your brain keeps thinking that there is there. So I love doing those sorts of things with the music, and adding extra elements of fear that may be physical, that may be metaphysical, that may not even exist at all. And how can the music add in those extra levels of something to make it more than just a complementary tool, but could also be another character in the world of the film.
Yeah, and the woodblocks thing, that's awesome because it's like, I mean, I think when you're scared or you're tense, like you're already just like listening, like you're just trying to find something and try to listen for something. So you're kind of expecting something, but then you go like, oh, what's that? What's that? And then even when you're watching, you're also kind of in that space. When you're, as an audience member and you're participating, you are on the lookout when you're like, what's the film going to throw at me? And then you kind of cut through and just where they don't expect it, we're just in the score, which is awesome.
Exactly. I used those and whispered vocals, and the two combined was just terrific.
That's awesome.
In the right way.
Well, I want to jump over to Ethan now, specifically just talk about Goosebumps. Ethan, Goosebumps is known for its blend of kind of humor and horror. So how do you balance, I guess, these contrasting elements in sound design to make sure you're, keeping it fun, but also can keep you on edge and give you a little, tension or a little spook every now and then?
Yeah. This is going to sound like a weird answer to that question, and I don't really have to, because comedy and horror are oddly two halves of the same coin, or two sides of the same coin, right?
Agreed.
So when we play things, bigger can be funnier. It can also be scarier or more horrifying. So you can kind of use the same sounds, and the context around that, whether it's the music, the performance, the color of the scene, or the production design, all these things come together to sort of tell you whether or not this is funny or horrifying. For an example, not from Goosebumps, but I do the show You, and we have a scene where a body is being dismembered, and it's gross and horrifying, and we play up all those gross and horrifying sounds, but then they throw Cardi B over the top of it, and it becomes funny, and it's now dark comedy. So the balance is really created by the combination of all the elements of production and music going into all that. And then when you're in the mix is where you're really trying to find what is the thing that is selling, if this needs to be scary or if this needs to be funny, how loud do we play things, how subtly do we play things. And that's where you're going to put it all together. But the actual sound selection itself, I think they're they're all kind of both the same thing. You know, in horror and comedy, nothing ever works, right? Like
Right.
there's no such thing as a well-oiled door in either of them. That creak is going to be scary and it's going to be funny depending on what else is happening around it. So
Absolutely.
yeah, it's kind of nice to be able to play in both things. And lastly, just, you know, when you think about it, like whenever you watch an audience in a horror movie and there's a big jump scare, the first thing they do is they laugh after it.
Yeah.
So we're just trying to create a sense of entertainment at all times, and playing stuff up and being a little brash with what we're choosing to do. And the laugh or the fright is going to come naturally from everything else combined with it.
Yeah, it's funny because they do. I think people think they're on like opposite ends of the spectrum, even though they're just really, really married. And I'm glad you mentioned that thing because that is true. When you're in a complete sold out theater and you have this big scary moment and everyone kind of falls for it, the release of that is laughter, and it's just like,
Right. And like comedy, you know, like the audience gives you permission to be scared. Like you can feel the tension in the
Yeah,
room with the audience, and it gives you permission to laugh at something that you might not laugh at if you were sitting there alone because you heard somebody else laugh at. And so yeah,
right.
there's this communal thing in both comedy and horror that also gives context to what it is that you're doing.
Yeah, see, I didn't even think about that because if you see a comedy in a sold out theater, again, it's way more funny with a
It's way
crowd
funnier. Yeah,
Yeah.
than it is when you're
absolutely.
watching at home
Yeah.
alone and you're just, you'll maybe chuckle at a joke when you can belly laugh when you have this communal, and it just shows just
Yeah.
how much we are just part of, like, we want to be with other people in there. That's why I think
Yeah.
the theatrical experience is so unique. Yeah.
And of course, when you watch a comedy at home and you're done laughing, but the picture is edited so that the audience laugh that was going longer. And so now there's this big dead spot and it becomes less funny at home. So you kind of, I
Right.
feel like you really do need to see these things with people. It adds so much to the whole experience of watching the movie.
Yeah. And yeah, Ryan, jump on in.
Yeah, Ethan, it's really cool to hear you say that because that's something I also, learned by scoring horror films. I remember the first horror films that I scored. I guess I was just going off of the references of my own frame of reference of horror movies. So when I was younger, most of the horror movies that I saw were the ones that were really genuinely scary. And so when I started scoring horror films, and then I saw them with audiences and I saw that people would laugh, like they would get that relief from it, or something would be campy and they would enjoy it in that way of laughing. And that was such an eye opener for me. I was like, oh, that's really cool. It's almost like the audience is in on the joke too. It's like going to like a theme park. You're just excited you got scared on a ride, and it's part of the
Right.
fun of it.
Yeah, you're always kind of telling yourself it's just a movie,
Right.
at a certain point. And I feel like that's, some of the best experiences where you're just like, oh my God. And then it's like, oh, it's just a movie. And everybody
Yeah.
can enjoy this sort of moment together. But yeah, as far as the sound editing goes, we just play it up and have as much fun with it as we can. And I think the mood and the emotion is going to come from everything else around it. And if it works, it's because all the elements of cinema came together at one time and made it work.
Yeah, and it's just funny to me that fear, at least in general, is this like baked in instinct that we have as humans that just, kept us alive when our ancestors were like, running away from like the, from dangers in the world. And now we live pretty safe, comfortable lives. Then we use entertainment to kind of tap into that instinct still to like bring it out, but we're in the safe theater so we can laugh with it. And then you have like, directors that go from, like Jordan Peele goes from sketch comedy to horror, and Danny McBride co-writing, Halloween. And so it really is super interchangeable, and I'm glad we explore that. It's really, really fun to explore. But yeah, so I want to go back around the group again and talk about, is there a general rule? I guess I want to ask everyone, is there a general rule of thumb for creating like a spooky sound? Are there go-to notes, like certain notes or melodies that really kind of hone in on it, or instruments or sound effects? Like I know, Ethan mentioned the door can be spooky or scary. So I'm curious, for you and your repertoire, is there like a go-to thing for you guys that just really just like, this is where I go to if I really kind of want to get a spooky sound out? So Jennifer, if you want to kick us off.
Sure. I'm always with the philosophy as, a filmmaker, whether it's just an audio space or a visual filmmaker for music supervision or producing, that it comes with story and character first.
Yeah.
Because when you're going into the horror genre, you know, at the essence, what I love about the horror genre is it's a commentary about relationships. It's about different social things. It's a very interesting genre. You can really storytell in kind of a different way, where other genres kind of pigeonhole you. You know, you have your comedy horror, you have your serious, you have your slasher horror. There's so much more, I feel like, levels in there. So when I
Yeah.
go through for my sound, whether it's music or if it's an audio thing about creating some sort of sonic world, is what's the story? What's the characters? What's the intention? Right. So for Hollow's Bend, the radio play, we're in a school and we have like a creaking and a wind, and but we still get an essence of that old school that we're in, right? Versus a creaking sound that might be in an old house, or whether you're in the spirit world, is that I really kind of dive into what's the character, what's the story, and what am I trying to do? What is it going to add? If it doesn't add anything, what's the point of it? So I don't
Right.
really have like a go-to sound, but I kind of go more based on character, story, what I'm trying to convey to my audience in that kind of realm. It could be music, it could be sound design, it could be a sound, it could be how we move around a line from a script or a character, how we break it up in post, but everything kind of is intentional back to story, character, and environment.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Ryan, how about yourself? Is there anything go to in your toolkit?
Well, I think there are certainly sounds that we've all, heard many times, whether it's going to be aleatoric effects with the orchestra doing, atonal music or, clusters or slams or putting in interesting instruments, like random bowed things that sound, you know, um, off-putting. But really, I'm like Jennifer. I think about what's best to serve this individual story at any given time. So I just look at it as though all available tools are there, and sometimes going against the grain can be
Yeah.
wonderfully scary. Like, for example, one might think, well, a major chord, that's happy, or a minor chord, that's sad or scary. Sometimes doing a major chord voiced low, can be terrifying. Like it's the opposite of what you're expecting. So I just think about what's specific for the projects. And in one particular thing I do think about, though, is, I think I touched on it earlier, is just thinking about who the audience is, because if it's
Yeah.
kids, then I really do need to make sure it's safe. So one thing that I do when I'm scoring for kids is, like, for horror. I did a movie, R.L. Stein's Monsterville Cabinet of Souls. Well, actually, the movie I just did is an R.L. Stein movie as well, which is Zombie Town. Is
Yeah.
that I'm thinking about how to make it palatable. And the way that one of the things that I do when I'm scoring those types of films is I try to not do too much that's like screeching or, atonal with the orchestra. I try to do it more harmoniously in a way, so if I'm doing minor chords, whatever, it's like you can transcribe it. There are melodies, there are harmonies, there are progressions, there are things that we all can kind of hang our hat on, that we're used to hearing certain types of things like that. So maybe it could come across as more like devilish or ghoulish, or
Yeah. Yeah.
or diabolical or whatever, but it's not going to be, like so off-putting that it sounds like torture.
Absolutely. Yeah. Spencer, about you? Like, would you agree with Ryan saying what's in your toolkit?
I would absolutely agree with what everyone has said so far. Because I think horror is, I think, interesting enough. I find horror to be the most creatively freeing genre. You'd think
Yeah.
that it
Yeah.
wouldn't be, because you just sort of expect, as Ryan said, aleatoric screeches and things like that. I actually find it to be the opposite. More and more, I'm finding myself not using those things and going away from those things and seeing what else we can do. I mean, I'm working on a film right now where it's Appalachian music. Can I take banjos and make those Gary without going boom, how can you
Yeah. Yeah.
find a way to make those freaky?
Yeah.
But beyond that, I'm going to touch on something which Kaya, you mentioned about a primal fears, and I've learned that humans are incredibly sensitive to frequencies in the top range and in the like a bottom range, that being babies and sirens and things like that, versus earthquakes and thunderstorms. When you combine those two things and kind of put them on top of one another without anything in the middle, that is just frightening. I don't know why, but for some reason we
Yeah.
just get like completely just like I'm like uneasy about it. So I love using some kind of variation on that. What can we do in the bottom end? What can we do again the top end? Nothing in the middle. Different rhythms, different harmonies, different kind of ways of using musicalities that aren't just sound effects and or drones and things like that. But how can music can be used in a way that we haven't really, that isn't, that's not normal, and mostly music is written in the middle register and not much happening, you know,
Right.
everywhere else. So when you flip it, that can create a sense of unease that I find very effective. And how can you do that with banjos, for example, with bagpipes? How can you find ways to then manipulate those into a terrifying way? I find very freeing, because again, this genre is perhaps one of the most freeing that there is, and you, despite the fact that it has a sound, when you go against that sound, you can do whatever you want, and somehow it works.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the horror genre is also the most like, I mean, I feel like all of you are just experts also as like, just, you're kind of like psychologists as well, because you're kind of figuring out what ticks, like makes humans tick, what, you know, you're kind of feeling your own emotions, but you're also seeing what works on other people. And you're, as storytellers, that's what you do. Like you're telling a story and you're trying to make the audience feel a certain way, or feel something. And I think the psychology of music and sound is so interesting. And just like Spencer, what you were talking about, just finding these things and finding which ranges, like, and there's science behind it. I mean, like, you know, we have like the way our brains work, and the, it's just a very complex thing in here. And it's just always trying to explore. That's why we still tell stories, you know, since the dawn of time. And it's like we're still finding ways to do things and tell things. So that's super interesting. Absolutely. Ethan, for you, is there a kind of go-to sound? I love the, you know, you're talking about the door creaking, but like beyond the kind of like tropes and stuff like that, are there like certain things that you really kind of go to kind of really get people to, you know, feel something?
Yeah. I mean, it's not a specific sound, but I think a philosophy is, you know, for us when we're dealing with things that are practical, and I'm not talking about sound design stuff, you know, monsters and whatever, you can kind of do whatever you want. Those are going to be scary on their own. But when we're talking about the real world stuff that characters interact with, what we try to do is take the sound that we think is the most realistic and then break it. So that phone ring, we warp it just a little bit. You know, in
Yeah.
Goosebumps, two of the first three episodes, one, the featured prop is a Polaroid camera. So take a standard Polaroid camera and beef it up and warp it a little bit and break it. And then episode 3, it's a cuckoo clock. And it's the same thing where that cuckoo clock is just, there's just a little something that's not what you used to hear at your grandparents' house, you know,
Right.
just to make it a little bit unsettling. So I think like overall for horror, that's kind of the philosophy that we operate with, is to just break the sound that you would normally hear.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally agree. Well, I want to jump now just over to Ryan real quick, because Ryan, you kind of touched on something you're talking about, kind of what also not just like audiences, whether for kids or for more, you know, an adult audience, but between Zombie Town and Trick or Treat Scooby Doo, you kind of, they're different sides of the horror genre. You have, you know, you have something that's animated that's more geared to a younger crowd, maybe live action. Do you approach things differently in terms of if it's something like that, whether it's animation or live action, or for kids or adults? I know, I think we touched on this a little bit on our animation panel a while back, where you can be a little bit bigger in animation, maybe a little bit more, you know. But so I'm curious, in your perspective as the composer, what do you see?
Well, specifically with these two films, yeah, the approaches are completely different, and in particular, this Scooby Doo is really different because it's largely a comedy. You know, it's Scooby Doo. So even though I am going into all these like scary and Halloween and trick or treating sounds, animation really can turn on a dime, and
Yeah.
usually hang out too long in any one musical style. You know, you might be capturing a sound for 20 seconds, and next thing you know, Scooby and Shaggy are doing something funny at the vending machine. And
Yep.
so now you do a non sequitur over to there. So So that's one of the biggest differences I find, like I found on Zombie Town, which is a live action film, that I could really stay within one sound longer. You know, whether I'm doing an emotional cue or romantic cue, because there were all these different styles within this film, but I can actually write a piece and do something for a minute or go longer before I have to do a quick change up. And animation is just always, you know, on its toes.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I want to kind of go back around the room again and talk about, everyone kind of talked about their approaches and certain, things they like to go to and how they see things. But I'm curious about how much experimentation plays in this process, especially when you're trying to find new ways to do things and try to kind of think outside the box and think outside of, archetypes and tropes and kind of formula, especially with horror is so easily to fall into that kind of like jump scare formula or certain patterns or certain editing patterns or score patterns or music patterns. But Spencer, I'm interested, maybe you want to kick us off because I think you were really trying to explore not doing, what the unexpected is. So I'm curious, what's your kind of experimentation process and how much time do you allow yourself to have that? If you have that kind of luxury on a project, which sometimes you don't, but I'm curious, like, how do you work on that process?
On TV, you never really have much time.
Right.
So on SurrealEstate, the biggest challenge of that is every house needs its own something, whether it's a theme or whether it's a palette. I decided to go for both a theme and a palette. Let's do something completely different for every single episode that can make this house stand apart from something else. And it's challenging because yes, we have our general palette, but we also need to figure out, okay, this house has a Norwegian sensibility. This one is more Hungarian. Then we have one where it's people possessed by dogs, and how do you make that work? And I thought, well, let's use dogs as music. And so my assistant and I went and recorded a bunch of dogs barking and howling and growling and doing all the things that dogs would do, and
Yeah.
turned that into music. Found a way to make those rhythmic, melodic, harmonic, and just how to make music out of something that I've never heard before. And I think it made that episode really pop beyond a lot of the other ones, and every other one also has something else which makes it pop. But that was such a special moment in trying to write music without using the orchestra, without using guitars or whatever, just like anything else was. And that process I find in this show is kind of going back to what I said earlier, just freeing. Like it's really just creatively exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. Ethan, how about yourself? Like in terms of like just experimenting with sound editing and finding, like, how much time do you usually have to kind of play around and kind of find what's right?
In TV, not much. It depends. We were sort of unlucky and lucky at the same time on a show like Goosebumps, where we had to move really fast, but we never had visual effects. So those were trickling in much slower than what we were doing. And so the experimentation was always, well, the filmmakers would tell us what we were going to see, and we would make
Right.
something, and then we would see it, and we'd all kind of agree, okay, well, what we did isn't really lining up to what that looks like, and then we would redo it. And in a lot of cases, we had to sort of give multiple options. So we were experimenting all together, just with us, the mixers, and the filmmakers, because in what I do, especially, it's very, very subjective. And
Yeah.
what I think works might not be what the filmmaker wants or thinks is working. And so, in a case like Goosebumps, where every episode had these signature sounds, whether the prop or monster or something like that, we sort of had to create multiple versions of what we thought might work, because that show especially is straddling this weird line between scary and kids, between nostalgia and something new and fresh. And where that line is, nobody could tell you specifically until you saw it. You just sort of had to trust that when you got it, you had it.
Right.
So we did a lot of versions of a lot of different things and would play them back and then have to go in and revise them and everything. So that's not a luxury we often have, especially like on network TV, where we have an air date that's really close to when we're mixing.
Yeah.
Goosebumps fortunately aired in October, and we started working on that in January. So we had a long period of time where we were able to play around and try things until we got a consistency that worked from episode to episode.
Yeah, that's definitely rare, but like so much, I'm sure you had a lot of time to just play around. But Jennifer, for you, like when you have nothing but sound, I'm curious how much time do you have to experiment? And since it's so important, it's so kind of like integral to the story.
Yeah, it's interesting for me working on both mediums, just how your process has to change and how you view sound and how to work with sound. So, especially with a radio play, you have nothing but sound.
Right.
So it's so important. And we were like playing with different things, and especially when it comes to music, if you're used to working only in the audio visual medium, you approach sound and music very differently than when it's just in the audio. And sometimes I'd be playing with something, I'm like, oh, this is great. And then I'm like, wait, no, that doesn't work for the audio space. That only works for an audio visual space. So really the experimentation is this going to work? Is it not going to work? We don't have the same kind of build in the same way that a visual media have, that if you're putting music to picture for storytelling, now you have all these characters, you have to create environments, you have to create texture. We take place, in the 80s. So it's like an 80s modern mix that if you're listening as a teenager, do you feel that 80s vibe versus listening to it with your mom that she's like, oh yeah, that was kind of, 80s, and having to figure out what is modern, what's a little vintage, how to not make it, like it's a Stranger Things ripoff, right? Stranger Things was,
Right.
the whole modern 80s kind of vibe, that you have to create a new sonic space while adding music to characters, whether it's environment, what they're going through, their introspective space in the audio where you can't see anything. And you have a character saying, oh my gosh, like, why did this happen? Why don't people like me? All these different things. And then also playing into the jokes, because Paula's Been the radio play also is comedy. It's kind of like a comedy, horror, supernatural, story. So just playing with those different things that we would try. And also we have to, work with actors, not just visual actors, but voice. And they have their own sonic tone with their characters that you have to complement and not take away from their performance, which is a different type of, puzzle piece that you don't have in the audiovisual media in the same way. So there's
Yeah.
a little bit of experimentation. The good part about this project was we had a little bit more time to kind of try things. It wasn't like TV that's like really quick, or a film you're like, oh my gosh, I have to submit this to whatever or it's due. So we had a little bit more time to play, but that was the fun part, being able to take lightning and how do we make lightning sound different but still be recognizable and add music to that. Is it a music lightning or is it a sound design lightning? Is it adding, is
Yeah.
it taking away? And that was really fun to be able to have a little bit more time than I'm used to kind of play and really dig into these different scapes and characters.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just love that, I feel like the, radio plays, like, I think they should be more popular than they are. Like, I know it's kind of, it seems like, oh, that's how we started. We, our family gathered around the radio before television. But like now that podcasts have really exploded, and I feel like narrative podcast or fictional like plays like this, like in the world, I mean, people are on the go, and it's just like I feel like it's such a great thing. Like, and it's such immense and story. I remember we did it in college when I went to film school. We did an audio class. We were supposed to do like a radio play, and it was so much fun. And I feel like I haven't really touched on that since then. And I feel like more people should really explore that.
Well, that's what I thought too. And that's, kind of where this came from, that,
Yeah.
myself and the creators, we, really dived in because we also come from a storytelling theater background. So
Yeah, it's so
I agree with
perfect.
you. Radio plays are great and they're fun, and it's like a family friendly thing as well as a community thing. I think bringing community back together, like we were talking about theaters, right? Getting together,
Yeah.
but there's something awesome about turning on the radio, sitting around and listening to a story and being in a moment together. And everyone has a different idea of where we are. What does this person look like? All these different things. And it creates
Yeah.
this kind of fun dinner party.
Absolutely. No, I totally agree. Ryan, how about you? What's kind of your perspective of all of it in terms of
Well, I love to
experimentation and
experiment.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I love experimentation. It's just it goes hand in hand with just creativity in general. And so I'm constantly experimenting. Actually, one aspect I'd love to maybe chat about with experimentation, because I'm always experimenting with sounds and instruments, and I'm experimenting with harmony and melody and all the musical composition type elements. But the part that I'd love to also talk about is how much experimentation I do with how the music synchronizes to picture. because the timing of music to picture,
Yeah.
it's, you know, it's everything. And I give a lot of thought to how music can shape the story, whether it's going to be something where I'm doing some really heavy lifting, where I'm going to do like a misdirect, or, you know, try to, you know, fake the audience out to think one way or another, but also sometimes more subtly, where it's like, where exactly does a character make a decision, or can I make a musical shift at a certain time that is going to make that actor's performance feel like it was, you know, motivated, you know, that now the audience feels something just before the character says it. Or, you know, I love experimenting with that, especially when there's scenes that it's not as clear how you might want to shape it musically.
Yeah.
Like, for example, if it's a conversational scene, maybe it's two people that are just, you know, having a conversation for 3 minutes, but you're going to put music behind it. So now it's like, okay, it's not like I'm synchronizing to all these obvious moments that are happening, like, oh, the door opened or this happened, and now it's like we're going to do something different. It's like, how are you going to shape like a 4 minute conversation? And so I love experimenting with that,
Yeah.
in
Do you
addition to all the creative aspects of composition.
Sure. Do you ever find, like, say you were working on a project and the director is just in love with the temp and they really just like structured the whole edit to the temp, and then when the temp is gone, you that structure is kind of just like frozen like that, and you kind of like, do you find it harder to play with timing in that sense, if the edit is really tied to, or somebody else's timing? Like, I'm curious.
I've never worked on a project where the filmmakers were tied to the temp.
That's awesome.
No,
That's
just kidding.
good.
Totally kidding.
Okay, never mind. I was like, what's the first I
No,
ever heard.
that is so normal. That's kind of like 95% of the time, you know,
Yeah.
is, you know, people get very attached to the temp, especially when an editor is editing to it.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. Because
Like
they need like that to help to build it. And if you're not there to early on to give you your music or something, then but is that, yeah, I'm curious, is that frustrating? Like when you're trying to like figure your way through it? Like,
Well, my answer to that is that I've actually found a way to address that in my creative process. And the way what the process that I've come up with for doing it is, well, let me just restate the issue, which you're already stating, which is, if you listen to the temp music, now it's fresh in your ear, and now you're going to go
yeah,
write your own thing immediately after it. But you literally just listened to the temp 1 second ago. It's like now you're influenced by everything about that temp, you know, the
sure.
harmony, the pacing, you know, the whatever, every aspect. So if I really want to try to write something that achieves what the temp does, but not hear the temp seconds before I'm going to go write it, the trick that I have come up with is, when I am done writing for the day of all the cues that I'm going to write today, I'll take a look at what cues I'm going to write tomorrow. And I will, in my working session, I'll put markers in my session of all the different shifts that the temp music did at those different times. It's like, okay, it starts off subtle strings, and then the melody came in at this part, and then it's sort of, you know, decrescendoed, and then there was a hit at this moment, or whatever, you know, and I put all that stuff into my markers. And so that way, when I go write that cue the next day, I don't listen to the temp, but I have all of the important information that I needed from the temp, because I already, you know, wrote all that down. So that's
Yeah.
one way I kind of free myself up, for doing that.
That's
But
great. I mean, that's an awesome thing, because you kind of you built you have you my music needs to hit this point here and kind of come back down here, and you're not influenced by, yeah. So you have the shape that your music needs to take for the picture, which is what all the score needs to do anyway. So
yeah.
I think that's a great workaround.
But
I've
I'll
never
just say
heard that.
one quick thing is that sometimes you don't have that luxury. So I have built
Sure.
up this, you know, skill, I suppose you'd say, to be able to listen to temp and very quickly kind of do my own thing about it. It's all part of the gig, you know. It's just so normal. That's all built into it.
There's no greater love than temp love.
Here, here.
So it's a love-hate relationship for sure.
Yep.
Absolutely. Well, I want to jump real quick over now to Jennifer, to ask you what, I think we already kind of touched a little bit, but what really drew you to that unique format of the radio play for Hollow's Bend, and I guess how did it influence your approach to music supervision compared to more traditional visual mediums? Like, we kind of talked about what drew you there, but like, how did it influence, I guess?
So what drew me to the story of Hollow's Bend is I've noticed just in a lot of content that's been made, I would say in probably the past 10 years, and just me growing up, the trajectory of story for the YA crowd has been different. And I realize, also talking to the creators, we all realize that if we were the demographic nowadays, there'd be no content for us, because everything that's
Yeah.
being made is of a certain thing. There's a place for that. But when it comes to certain stories and from certain people's backgrounds or personalities, there's not as much content that we would be gravitated to. There's no Buffys, there's no X-Files, there's no any of that stuff. So we kind of wanted to create a story that filled that market in the young adult market, where, you don't have maybe people having sex at a young age, because there's not a lot of shows that talk about that. And a lot of shows created now, like I said, there's a place for everything. There's kind of gifting more towards, you have to do drugs, you have to make that decision, all those
Sure.
things. There's not a lot of young adult content that gives you a different kind of point of view. Or if you're maybe that's not what you're interested in watching, there is stories for you. So that kind of really drew me, that there isn't a lot of young adult content that fits that, right? In between when you're growing up, your middle school, your high school, maybe just starting off in college, everyone's unique and different in their story and their likes. For the radio play, again, I come from a theater background as well. So I thought it'd be also fun to take a pre-existing story that the creators wrote and, let's turn it into something that is a pre-existing IP, full disclosure. And we turned it into a radio play to create a pre-existing IP, but also to give the YA demographic a story that they can really gravitate to. And it's been really kicking off, as a 100% independent project. And which is exciting that I'm seeing there is a need for these types of stories, and to be a creator, to create those types of stories, I think is exciting, to give this demographic a different perspective. And again, with the audio and visual, it's a different puzzle, and I love both. Storytelling is so broad, and there's so many different types of mediums, and there's different types of stories and characters, that you don't have to be pigeonholed just in one thing. And there's audiences that need to be served that maybe are not being served in how current film and TV storytelling is doing, as opposed to maybe things before. And to find those safe spaces for those audiences where they feel like they're being heard. They feel like their story is important, I think is important for me as a storyteller, whether it's in the audio space or the visual space as well.
Yeah, no, I agree with that completely, because I feel like since when we were growing up, it was like, it was like network TV, and then cable was very like, oh, what's on cable? What's on this? But now, like, with the rise of HBO and the rise of streaming, it's like sex and drugs. Everyone just wants to be titillated all the time. And, you have, every show is just trying to, like, how can we push the envelope here and here, but just to, and I feel like shock value became almost like numbing, and we were kind of numb to it now. So it's like, to find a way to tell real, go back to storytelling and find, something that's character based and, stuff like that. It's not just aesthetic and style and all that stuff.
Well,
So yeah.
and also there are audience members out there, especially young adults or people coming up, that, with what the contents we made, like I said, there's nothing wrong with it, but everyone's unique and different.
Sure, yeah.
It's okay if you don't drink in high school. It's okay if you're not making those decisions, but there are no stories for you to watch. That it gets to a point where you're
Right.
like, is there something wrong with me because I don't want to
Yeah.
do it? Because all you're seeing and being pushed is, you need to drink, you need to vape, you need to do drugs, you need to do these things, that we're missing out on those things. When we were growing up, there would be those conversations about decisions with characters and stories. I don't see a lot of that in young adult anymore. I really
Yeah.
don't.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Definitely. So I guess I want to go back around, and we can just maybe just, we can jump into it, because we kind of touched a little bit of how, do you guys draw inspiration from other genres, specific genres other than horror, when it comes to, horror and thrillers? I know we kind of talked about comedy a bit, but is there like maybe action rhythms that work well changed for horror, or if there's maybe something that's romantic that can work well for something that's gothic? I'm curious if anybody has experience with that, and I'm just going to open it up if anyone wants to jump in, to talk or share.
I can jump in
I'll
there.
go ahead, Spencer.
Yeah.
Sorry. Go ahead, Jennifer.
Oh no, I was gonna say, go ahead.
Okay, so I love the early Disney films, Fantasia, and there's something about Fantasia in its almost ballet-esque use of music finding a way to use that in this genre is such a great way to make the music feel like it's another being in the picture. Like
Yeah.
I often mute the dialogue and the sound effects and see if the music can emulate whatever the emotions were that would have been coming from those in just the music, and seeing if those can picturesque some kind of almost like a haunting spirit or haunting fantastical kind of an element over it, even if it's even if it's like a drama, or if there's nothing supernatural. Yeah, in the film, coming at it from almost like a ballet gives the music another type of an energy that I find it doesn't happen when you're scoring it in a more, I have to watch out for the dialogue, I have to watch out for the sound effects. You're
Yeah.
able to almost make the music feel like it's, yeah, like it's a supernatural entity kind of, and then they're almost making it a character or a another world. Like in SurrealEstate, so much of that music is to try and make it the ghost that we're not seeing, or the afterlife,
Yeah.
or the spiritual realm. And looking at it in a way of ballet has helped me to add one extra element of fantasy in there that might not be if I was scoring it more traditionally.
Yeah, Fantasia was the movie. My mom has told me that that was the first movie that she put me like in my like rocker in front of to like watch as a kid, and maybe that's why I'm so obsessed with scores now. Even though I'm not a musician or a composer, but it's what got me into filmmaking. It's just like I also watched a lot of nature documentaries as a kid, so it's like it's music and movement. It's just like how the image works with the picture too. So I think that's a big part of it as well. And then based on what Ryan was talking about, finding kind of how the
Yeah,
movement and timing with
exactly.
everything. So yeah, absolutely. But anybody else? Yeah, Jennifer, what were you going to talk about?
I was going to say that for music or just anything, I'm always inspired by so many genres and stories. I mentioned in that mist, we're going back to different time periods. So, really thinking about history and like thinking about history in a different way of saying what was scary back then for people back then in history, but then how do I turn that into sounds that you recognize as an audience member and
Yeah,
music, but also give it something new, unique, and dynamic. So I really kind of, I'm inspired by drama, by comedy, by romance, the gothic romance stuff, with the horror, the old
right.
horror stuff, Edward Allan Poe's poems, like all the different, whether it's literature as well, I think
Yeah,
just inspires me to kind of think a little bit outside the box to take it to the next level or to make it approachable for a listener or a viewer, that they can connect to the audience, the story, the characters, the environment. I think it's just not everything's always like it has to be horror, it has to be comedy, it has to be drama, it has to be romance. I think everything plays on each other because that's just humanity and how we connect worldwide as
yeah.
humans.
Yeah, and I love pointing out literature too, because it's just like also every movie starts every as a script on the page, and word choice and word structure and sentence structure, the way Edgar Allan Poe writes, it concocts a certain image, concocts sounds. You come with the sounds, you read it, go, okay, I'm hearing the word and stuff like that. So I think that's definitely it for sure. Yeah, does anybody else want to chime in or
I'll chime in.
yeah,
I'll just say I totally agree. I mean, I think that more so in a way from drawing from other genres is just that, for me, I've spent, the better part of my entire life, thinking about how to convey emotion through music. And so much of the depth of that skill set, I suppose, just comes from working in different genres because there's different ways that you would do things, whether, it's a romance or it's a horror or just different things. And so what I find is that the one thing that's so common between every project is most projects are human stories. And
yeah,
so it's just about conveying, those emotions. And so, like you were saying, Kaya, like, would I take something from a action, approach and use that in a horror? For sure, if there's an action sequence, in
sure,
that
yeah,
horror film. So I think just innately I'm thinking about every single genre because every single genre is part of humanity. So
yeah.
I'm definitely not thinking limited, like, oh, now I'm doing a, fill in the blank, and now I'm just sort of painting with that palette, like totally, it's everything is being drawn from experience from every genre.
Yeah, and I think the more I talk about genre, the more I don't like talking about genre because it really boxes like and it's like a comedy has to be this or a horror has to be this. And and even what Ethan, what you're talking about, certain sound effects can just work depending on the context, can be scary or funny, or it can be this or that. And it's like my favorite like horrors are also comedies, whether it's like Tremors or something like that. And it's just like there's always these blurred lines. That like a Western is would say my favorite genre, but I also consider like Breaking Bad a Western. And like I talked to Marco Beltrame, he's like, oh yeah, Scream is a Western. Like that's a Western. Like that's just like every score I've done is a Western. And it's like the
I
genre
agree.
just
Yeah.
it's just like I think the genre can be so like limiting, and you kind of remove those walls and just tell the story, whatever the characters are, human or not, but like whatever the character
Right.
and the emotions are, it just dictates it. Sure.
Mhm.
But so yeah, I want to jump over to Spencer, real quick, and maybe Spencer, you could talk about how music was used to enhance the world building in SurrealEstate, because you mentioned how each house has to have a certain atmosphere, a certain feel. So how are you world building with each episode of the show?
We've actually touched upon it just recently on even in SurrealEstate, we have comedy and we have horror, we have family drama, and we have all these types of things. And finding the palette of that took me a very long time to discover what that could be, because we have to equally, have a scene where we're in the depths of fear, and then there's a couple of jokes, and then we got to be crying by the end. So trying to find the balance of that took a very long time, and I love infusing everything with a little bit of a fantasy. Maybe I'm a fantasy nerd kind of in that kind of way, but finding a way to make the music be another essence. And thankfully, SurrealEstate was shot in a beautiful Newfoundland, and Newfoundland has a very Celtic background, and so like instantly after feeling all these landscapes, I thought, what if we infused Gothic like strings with modern guitars and things like that with Celtic instruments? What would that do to like this world, and how would that bring something new to it? And interestingly, what that did was it brought the afterlife from just being something that people talked about to being another essence kind of in the picture. Because I have a motto that I like using a lot, which is find the thing that's in the film but not in the film. So it's in the subtext, obviously, and it's maybe it's mentioned, or maybe it's part of the essence of the story, but there's nothing physical. There's no physical like embodiment within the picture. And in SurrealEstate, that was the afterlife. We never really see the afterlife. We experience it in terms of the characters are moving on, but we never really got a chance to really touch it or to really feel it. So by adding in these Celtic instruments and these other folk instruments and these other things that you wouldn't expect for a show about like realtors and ghost hauntings, it kind of brought something new to the whole picture and the whole palette that I feel is unique to only our show, and I've never heard anybody else do it, and I wouldn't even do it. It's like it's only for this one, and for something else we'll do something else. And I find trying to find that for each one of the houses and each one of the new characters that we meet, what is it that can we bring is part of this like story but isn't maybe physically represented, that I can add with the music to give it a sense of character or a sense of world building or a sense of fantasy that maybe might not be in there, but might be needed. And I'll do that also in comedies and dramas and in all other kinds of films, as I feel like storytelling is so much in the like the other and in the subconscious and in the imagination, that we infuse that with a little bit of something else, we can add extra depth that the film just might be asking for.
Absolutely. No, yeah, totally agree. So I guess to kind of wrap up our conversation this evening, I think we've touched upon so much about inspiration and different how to build themes and characters and all that stuff. So instead, I kind of want to finish off, maybe just go around the room and just talk about what's our favorite, maybe top horror film that we love. Like I'm curious what everyone, maybe in your mind, what is something you grew up with, or something now that you just really love? I think it's important to be fans of other films and stuff as well, and that's what inspired us to get into what we do. And for me, it was like, I think The Thing, for me, John Carpenter's The Thing, is my favorite horror film, just because it's so much psychological stuff going on. It's also practical effect. It's also score. It's also atmosphere, editing, these strange kind of fade to blacks. I mean, to me, that just encompasses everything that I want in a horror film. But I'm curious, Ethan, is there a horror film that you can think of that really kind of speaks to you on a personal level?
I'm really actually struggling to think of like the one that might stand out. The one that I have a lasting memory of, only because I hadn't seen it before I started working on a movie. This was really early on in my career, and the filmmaker, this was it was the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and the filmmaker worshipped that movie, and basically said on day one, he's like, "You're not allowed to work on my movie until you've seen the Texas Chainsaw Massacre," because I hadn't seen it before. And so I went home that night and I watched it, and I remember the thing that I remember most was how deliberate the dinner scene was, and how long it was, and how they just let you sit there and stew in it, which was
Yeah.
not anything that I remember experiencing. And now, especially, like, movies don't take their time scene by scene the way that thing did. And maybe it did out of necessity because of production and budget and everything else. But
Sure.
that's the thing that really, really worked, is that, you know, because you're in it so long, even the campier elements of that scene like really start to wear on you, and you really feel it. So I came back from that with sort of a new appreciation for a different kind of terror, which is just that feeling of being trapped
Yeah.
with horrible
Yeah.
people in a horrible place for a really, really long time.
Well, the one thing I love about horror as a genre itself is it's really a way for filmmakers to kind of just like really stretch a budget, because it's usually lower budget, and you kind of see this creativity like coming out. Like I did a binge watch with me and my wife one Halloween. We just did all the Friday the 13th, and that's something that I think everyone should do, because like you see everyone comes like, okay, we just have the same premise every single time. How do we change it up? How do we make it different? And then you just see the kind of the creativity. There's like charm in it. Like it's, some of them are really bad, some of them are really fun, some of them are like, whoa, that's pretty interesting. And then, you know, you get to Jason X and you're like, oh crap, whatever. But but it's like but there's so much creativity and you know, Tom Savini's effects, and you can find like the, I don't know, there's like the spirit of filmmaking is alive in those low budget ones, and I really really appreciate that. But yeah, Jennifer,
Yeah,
how
on
about
that
you?
note, I wish horror movies were bigger budgeted, because they
Yes.
are so sound and music intensive, and they're
Mhm.
all super low budget, and then they always come to us, and you know, we have to get into that spirit
Yeah, I know, you
of
have to save
independent
it. Like,
filmmaking
we're
as
out of
well.
money
And
now, save the film.
yeah, and those jobs are always really, really big, and then you'll get a romantic comedy that has 5 times the budget and be like, okay, well, this is really easy. Like,
Right.
can I move that money over to the horror budget? That'd be great.
Jennifer, for you, what's one of your
So
favorites?
I grew up watching horror. I was that weird child that loved watching horror films, like Disney films. I don't know what that says about my family or me, but that's fine. So I just remember watching horror films that were like from the 20s all the way through, but I love the horror genre. I love the commentary on it. I mean, I will say Scream is like one of my favorite films. I remember being like sixth or seventh grade, you
Yeah.
know, kind of thing. Also, I love Rob Zombie films. House of a Thousand Corpses is one of my
Yeah.
favorite films. I love Baby. She is like such a badass female crazy horror character, and you don't see a lot of female horror characters in that way, as kind of like
Yeah.
the mastermind, the killer, the manipulator in that way. So I just love Rob Zombie films a lot. I feel like he really gets into some of these like weird, quirky characters and family dynamics that are different than like a Texas Chainsaw Massacre, or even like a
Yeah, for
Scream
sure.
family dynamic. And also his, of course, use of music is always fun, from his composing score to like, you know, because he's a musician. So I always appreciate that too. But I
Yeah.
know it's a little quirky, but I love Rob Zombie films and House of a
No,
Thousand
I love Rob
Corpses.
Zombie too, and he'll come out every time and say like, you know, like F the critics and stuff like that. You know, he's just making
Oh,
what he
whatever,
wants.
critics.
Yeah.
They don't know a good film when they see it.
Exactly. He just makes what he wants, and you know, it does it. And people, and yeah, there's an audience for everything. That's the thing. Like people will connect to it. So yeah. But Spencer, how about yourself?
Guys, I'm such a scaredy cat. Opposite to Jennifer, I didn't watch horror until like 5 years ago. It was
Wow,
something that
that's
was more
interesting.
Yeah, I work in a lot of horror films, and a lot of it was just sort of like, I gotta finally start watching these movies as everyone keeps talking about them. And I love it. I'm now so passionate about these movies. I think that they are incredible filmmaking. I'm even talking about just like, yeah, they're all like lower budget, but just the creativity behind those and what they can do with the camera, what they can do with makeup and sets and costume. I'm just blown away. Absolutely love it. Currently, my favorite film in that genre is A Witch. I think The Witch is just
Oh
magnificent. What
yeah,
they
yeah,
did
yeah.
with sets and tension and stuff, and Corvin's score just blew me away. But I'm still catching up. I'm still catching up on a lot of decades of horror. So TBD.
And
Ask me again next year, and I'll watch
that's
a
all.
more
But
on it. But yeah.
it's awesome to hear that too, because I remember I was interviewing a composer. His name is Rich Verreel, and he goes by Disaster Piece, and he did It Follows.
I
If you
love
remember,
Disaster Piece.
if you It Follows, and it's like everyone's like, wow, this is just an amazing like 80s synth like horror score like John Carpenter. And I asked him like, what was your inspiration for this? He's like, I've never watched any horror film in my life, and I just kind of approached it the way my director was telling me to do it. And I'd never seen anything. I don't know what you're talking about, like all these references you're mentioning. I was like, wow, that is fascinating to me, just someone to come up with a fresh mind and not have any of that like kind of influence coming, and just approach it like seeing like, something brand new for the first time that we all know. So I think that also probably, Spencer, for you makes you like, that's, you're talking about the psychological things that you're doing with music. And it's like, I think if you had now that you're coming to it fresh, I think that gives a complete unique perspective. So I think that's amazing, actually.
I don't have the history behind it, so I don't. I know the tricks that people have done in the past. I'm now learning more and more of them. But yeah, I came at it
Right.
completely from
So you don't
let's
fall,
talk
yeah,
about.
it's your mind won't just
Yeah,
subconsciously go into tropes and stuff like that. So that's why I think that's pretty
we
interesting. Yeah.
we try the stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Ryan, for you, how about you want to close us out? What's something that you grew up with or you really love? Like,
Well, actually, like Spencer, I really didn't watch many horror movies when I was growing up. I got much more into it once my friends started making those films. And actually what you were saying, Ethan, rings so true about how many horror films are low budget. And and I know why that is. And it's because horror has like a built-in fan base, and it's not necessarily based on huge stars to have to be in it. Like people like the genre. And
sure,
so,
yeah.
so many of my filmmaker friends, when we were all sort of entering into the film industry at the same time, they started making horror movies because they didn't have big budgets. And they knew that if they could make a horror movie, there's some audience for this, and they don't have to pay a
Right.
lot for huge stars to do it. So I like Spencer, I just sort of jumped in and started scoring them because that's what my friends were making. And then I, through that, started watching more and getting more into it. But I think if I were to pick a horror movie that kind of stands out to me, and it's because it hits on three things that I really love, is Psycho. And the reason why I
Yeah.
love Psycho is just because, one, I'm a huge fan of Alfred Hitchcock, and I've watched a ton of Hitchcock movies. Two is Bernard Herrmann, who's just one of the greatest composers ever. And I love the score for Psycho. Of course, his approach to it, to do an all strings score, I'm sure everyone knows this, by now, but it's a black and white movie. And he came up with this approach of doing an all string score because to him, it would be like a black and white score, without all the other instrumentation. It's just strings.
Yeah.
But the other thing that I really love about Psycho is the story, because it starts off like the whole thing is a huge misdirect, because you start off in the beginning where you're following Janet Leigh's character, and you're thinking it's all about her. Halfway through the movie, you arrive at the Bates Motel, and then kablamo, it's like a totally different movie. And so if you didn't know that's coming, which we all know it's coming, but back then, what a great misdirect,
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
literally change the whole movie halfway through, and the first half isn't even what the movie is about. So I love that movie for those three reasons.
Absolutely, the craft behind it, just getting ahead of the audience, and just that's just a Hitchcock, his way that his mind worked. I guess it was just, yeah, always one step ahead of all of us. So,
Totally.
but yeah, but I mean, everybody, thank you so much for sharing all of your insights this evening. This, we've covered so much ground. I think you guys opened up your worlds to us, and it's been so inspiring and just so much fun. So I want to thank thank you, Ethan, Ryan, Jennifer, and Spencer, for all of your expertise and your passion and your insight, and and talking this evening. And thank you to Impact 24 for helping put this panel together. And to all of you who are watching, be sure to head back to Film Music Media to check out more panels and more interviews. So yeah, thank you so much, everyone. Have a
Thank
great
you.
evening.
Thank
Yeah.
Thank
you.
you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys. Thank you.